Papa Uniform 259er, 119er, break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time, over. Solid copy.
Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest tonight is Major General retired Pat Cavanaugh, United States Army, former Chief Signal Officer, United States Army, former Chief of Signal, has had a fantastic career as a signaleer, and I'm really excited to get the podcast back to its signal roots tonight. So, General, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
So, kicking it right off, sir, we kind of set things up before we hit record. And my first question is going to be, what inspired you to join the military in general and specifically to become an officer?
Excuse me. Well, I was commissioned in 1970, and I had to come into the military. Either I was going to be drafted and come in enlisted, or I was going to come in through the officer rank. And my dad was a retired master sergeant. And he always said, if you're going in the military, you go in as an officer. So that's the reason why I knew that I was going to go in. I went into ROTC, and it was because of my dad, really.
Gotcha. Now, did you want to be a signal guy from the get-go? Did you have to do a combat arms detail since it's Vietnam time? What was the experience like as you came on?
Yeah. Well, the spring that I was commissioned was the killings at Kent State that happened like a month or two before. And we had people all over campus with the armbands, and they would, out in front of our ROTC department, they would be demonstrating. So it was intense. And so the environment, so that was the environment. So I wanted to be a signaleer, and that's what I signed up for, because I had no intention of staying in the Army. I was going to stay in the Army. I was going to do my 2 years or 3, whatever it was going to be. I was going to get out, and I thought, well, maybe, I go be a lawyer. So I had no intention of staying, and I wanted to be a signaleer. And that goes back to the time that I was a dependent in Norway in the late 50s. And there were 2 events there that kind of colored it. One was Sputnik. The Russians put Sputnik up in 1957. And I remembered looking up into the heavens and seeing that orb flashing up through the sky over the night sky in Norway. And I mean, the Norwegians had they had gone, they were just aghast at that. So that had a big impact on me, the ultimate high ground. And then the other thing that really got me into communications was that I loved baseball. And so the baseball games were always played in the daytime back then. But in Norway, it'd be at night. So I'd try to be listening to the game, and Russian fishing trawlers would be sitting right off the coast of Norway. And they would come up and they'd sit right on the frequency of that the game was being transmitted on, Armed Forces Network Europe. And it would be something exciting, and then they'd start talking and you couldn't hear it. Half the stuff is... So I became enamored of communications very early on. And I thought, I like it. So that's what I want to do. So I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in Signal, and that's what I wanted to be.
That's absolutely amazing. The practical experiences you had as a very young man prior to even joining ROTC influencing you like that. That's really very fascinating. I got to go down this side street.
Sure.
So Norway during the Cold War, that's really, you don't hear about too many families being stationed in Norway. Can you share what that was all about?
Well, it was part of NATO. First of all, let me explain this clearing of my throat. I don't have any control over it. Stuff leaks all the time, and it's the only way. And I've got all kind of medicines and sprays and everything else. Nothing works. So I know it's irritating for everybody. It's irritating for me, but I just can't control it.
No worries, sir. We're thrilled to have you.
So Norway, well, we got there in 55 and we left in 59. And it was part of NATO. And there was the Hungarian Revolution that occurred in 56. And so that's when I really started to become aware of what was going on in the world. Of course, being in Norway, there were bombed out buildings that were there. Every now and then you'd be running through the forest and you'd find a belt buckle, a German belt buckle that had the swastika on it on one of the trails. So a bunch of Hungarian refugees came to Norway. Norway opened them with open arms and came in. And I was on the playground, and there was Hungarians there, there were Norwegians, and we were all just trying to get along. I could speak some Norwegian, I speak no Hungarian. And I have no idea what I did. I'm sure I did nothing, but the next thing I know, a Norwegian kid had me down on the ground and he was getting ready to pound my face for something. And all of a sudden, boom, this big guy came, and he was a Hungarian. He knocked that guy off of me, and he was going to knock the guy, and he looked at me and winked like, should I? And I said, no. So ever since then, I mean, that's really what opened my eyes to what was going on in the world.
I got you, sir.
And I was able to repay that. Once I was the CG of 5th Signal Command, I went into Hungary and met their chief of signal. And every time I was around Hungarians, I went out of my way to tell them how much I loved them, because it saved me from getting whooped.
That's awesome. That is a fantastic story. So fast forward to 1970. So you're commissioned, you become a signal officer. Were you able to go straight into your signal billet, or did you have to do any kind of detail?
No, I was, when I went in, I came in as a reserve officer. They were pushing regular Army, and I said, I don't want to be regular Army. I'm going to go in. I'm going to do 2 my years. I'm going to get out. So I went directly into my unit. Well, actually, I went to a radio systems course up at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey first. And then from there, I went to the 3rd Infantry Division, 1st to 30th Infantry.
And they were in Germany then, right, sir?
Yep. They were in headquartered then in Würzburg, and I went to the 1st Brigade, which was in Schweinfurt. And that's where the 1st to 30th Infantry was. And I mean, I absolutely loved it. I could, at the end of the month, when they pay you, I was thinking, man, this is almost like cheating. I'm having too much fun. I ought to be paying them for doing this. So I loved everything about it. Going to the field, crawling all over armored vehicles, doing stuff. I mean, it was just, I loved it. Spent 2 years there, and then I went down to the Signal Battalion, 123rd Signal, and spent another year down there. So right out of the gate, I didn't say that I was going to stay in the military, but what I had made up my mind then is I'm going to stay in the military until it's not fun.
Gotcha.
And that kind of was my driving goal, was to just enjoy what I was doing, do the best that I could do. And if it at some point in time became too much or it wasn't fun, then I would get out. And it took 32 years for me to get to that point.
Now, I'm not going to pretend I'm any kind of expert on the Cold War or on U.S. forces in Germany in the 70s, but I'm assuming you guys you were in an environment where the Soviet Union was your ultimate enemy, and you were part of a very large multinational force. You probably had assigned sectors. You probably had defensive positions you knew you were going to roll to. And I'm assuming unannounced alerts were a way of life, that kind of stuff.
All of that, yes.
So that's a very different time from, I'm a relatively young man at 53. And when I came out on active duty about 20 years after you did, so I mean, the wall had come down. Returning forces from Germany was kind of the focus. I think a lot of people of my generation and younger lose sight of the fact that Germany wasn't just an awesome place to be stationed because it was fun. You guys had a very significant real world mission that was similar to what you would see in 18th Airborne Corps with contingency missions, unannounced alerts. You got to be ready to go fight tonight, that whole thing. What was the culture like in 3rd ID at the time?
The war in Vietnam was going on. In every infantry company, there was 4 APCs in every platoon. And in every platoon, there was at least one vehicle that was put in admin storage because we didn't have enough soldiers to be able to man. So we truly were a hollow force. And thank goodness that the Russians never wanted to try anything with us. And of course, it was because I'm sure of the the fact that we had the nukes. But just as you described it, it was you'd roll out to get where you get a call. You had to clear the caserne within 2 hours, which, I mean, you have to move and scoot to be able to make all that stuff happen. And none of that happens by accident. We'd roll out into our local assembly area, and sometimes we'd actually roll up into our, not the actual general defense positions, GDP, but not too far away from them,
Right,
and then we'd go on to, sometimes we'd turn around, come back in. Other times they would kick off an exercise and we'd stay out for a week or two or whatever. So, and that went on every month that we did that. And so the first time I was there was in the 3rd Infantry Division. Second time I went to the 3rd Armored Division. Third time I went to the 3rd Armored Division. And that stuff still continued, was alerts out the gate, had to be cleared of the caserne within 2 hours to go up into your GDP. And the wall came down when I was in command in the 3rd Armored Division, and that was quite an experience.
I can only imagine. So now I'm assuming just the rough timeline from 1971 through 1989. We were talking. You saw the buildup of the Reagan years. You saw the air-land battle being adopted, the fielding of the Big Five weapon systems, that kind of stuff. So was it? This is a softball question, but I'm really interested in how you respond. What was the were there improvements in quality across the board, not just doctrine and material, but leadership and soldiers as well? Or was the soldier, even back in the 70s, even though you guys were hollow and it was a drafty army, was it still good material to work with, if you know what I'm saying? Or was it just like you had a higher quality of soldier later in your career?
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. When I first went in, I was in the 3rd Infantry Division. I mean, the quality was terrible. I mean, it was look, we had bad drug problems. We had terrible racial issues. When I was in the 1st Brigade, we had, well, you'd have to go to exorbitant lengths to be able to try to find people that had the drugs. And, one battalion would essentially have to stand down while other battalions came in, and the leadership they would help do the inspections to identify stuff. Other times we had racial issues where people they'd refuse to go do their duty. And that caused a lot of problems. So the early 70s in Europe was bad. I then came back and went to the 18th Airborne Corps. It's in the 35th, in those days, 35th Signal Group. And I was in the 327th Signal Battalion. And we had terrible AWOL problems. I mean, as soon as you'd have a formation, you'd fall back into the barracks, they'd be out the window and leaving on you. So then the next time that I came back to Germany was in the early 80s. I think it was, 81. That's when I went to the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Armored Division. And things had begun to change, and they were changing rapidly. So we were starting to get equipment. You could see the quality of the soldiers that were going up because of being in the volunteer army. And things just got better by leaps and bounds from the early 80s until the time I retired in 2002. They continued to get better. So I would say from the mid 80s on, we had the finest soldiers, we had the finest equipment, we had the finest training. It wasn't just that the leaders were good, it was good from top to bottom.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a really interesting perspective to hear, sir. I want to track back to what you were talking about when you were a young man trying to pick up baseball games on AFN, and the Russians would do some, sit on the channel and do some interference. Yeah. Did you have to deal with similar things once you're in Germany? Were there listening posts? Did you have to really be on your security measures when you guys were transmitting, Remoting
Yes.
your antennas, the whole nine. I mean, because you're
Yes.
literally a Cold War. You guys are in a
Yes.
combat environment. It's just nobody's opened fire yet.
Yeah. Well, so initially when I got to the Third Armor Division, it was uh, FM, all push to talk, because being in the brigade, and they used point of origin codes, which of course is a big no-no, but that's the way they did their business. And so we went up to Hohenfels and we were maneuvering, and I was the one that would have to go in and I'd talk to the ASA folks up there, and they'd say, oh, look, this is part of the, your unit's RTEP, you're going to be, we're going to be listening, and we're telling you that the big thing that we always run into is point of origin codes. So I went back as a brigade signal officer, and I just said, and my brigade commander was a guy by the name of Colonel Gordon Sullivan, who later became Chief of Staff of the Army.
I was going to say, I think I've heard of him, sir.
Yeah, that and so I went in there and I gave my spiel, and I said, if you use those, look, you can't use it. And this one battalion commander, I thought he wanted to take my head off. He was standing up and he was shaking his fist at me. You can't do that. And Sullivan told him, sit down. Look, we'll work our way through this. We've got it. So just, you understand what the ground rules are. So let's go from there.
Roger.
So yes, we're very aware of it. So, site selection was always very important. Radio procedures were always very important. And in those days, you were having to, you'd have to break out and you'd have to figure out the code to be able to send whatever it was that you wanted to send to people. Then after we moved beyond that, and then we had the frequency hopping radios, much, much better, much easier, but still, you had to be careful where you were situated, what your line of sight was going to be, where most of your electrons were going to flow, or what they were going to do against you.
Roger, sir. Do you feel, again, loaded question, I already know my answer, but I'm very interested in your response. Do you feel as we got more sophisticated technically, we're free copping now, we've got, better communication security keys, things of that nature, there's a degradation of that fieldcraft of how to do comms safely?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Oh no, you're right on target, because up until, well, when the Russians struck their tent and left the battlefield, everything just changed. It was like overnight. And then the Army was trying to fiddle around and figure out what their mission was going to be. And then, we had the first Gulf War. But as we went into these secure bases where everything was provided, and we were on these islands out all over the place, you had to stay on people about, so when you're laying cable or you're laying wire, you still have to have somebody looking at that wire if it's not encrypted, because somebody can still do it. And so that was always a challenge. And when I was in the 5th commanding, and we had the people down in Tuzla, down in Bosnia, and they were at Eagle Base, and they had been there for a long time. And one of the DISA inspectors went down there, and they went back and they briefed the DISA commander. And then I got a call from the J6 General Buckholz, said, Pat, now look, I'm about ready to pull the plug on them. And it was the 1st Armor Division, I think, in those days.
Yes, sir, sure was. I think it was under General Nash at the time.
I'm about ready to pull the plug because, I said, sir, don't do that. Let me talk to them. And I'm going to send a team from the 5th Signal Command down there. You give me a little bit of time and I'll make all that stuff right, and we'll do it the way it's supposed to be done. So I called Chief of Staff of the division, who was a friend of mine. And I said, hey, look, this is what's going on. He said, hey, they can't do that to it. I said, look, I don't think they're going to do that, because I'm sending guys down there. They're going to work directly for you. And we need to get this straight, and we need to get it straight pretty quick. And we went down there, and it took us a couple of weeks. We got it all in it, and it was good. But the point being is when you get into those environments, you get very complacent and you don't worry about what the threat is. And of course, there were people from, Bosniaks. They were all over the place anyway.
Roger that, sir. I saw similar things throughout the global war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. Not, and this is in no way disparaging the soldiers who deployed, but
Nope.
in the large areas like Liberty Base in Baghdad or Bagram in Afghanistan, it's Garrison breaks out very quickly if there's not a direct threat. And even
Yep.
though you are forward deployed, when it feels like Garrison, people revert back to their bad habits, either because they're overworked and it's a good shortcut, or they just get complacent. And in some cases, I saw this as time went on. People just didn't know anymore. You got a kid who maybe they were a platoon leader on 9/11, and they're gonna, no joke, they were probably back in the same area of operations as a battalion commander, and maybe they didn't know what things looked like pre 2001. So if nobody was there to teach them that, and that's what the culture became, that's what we're stuck with.
No, that's a great observation. That's why it's critical for leaders to do their job all the time. And you've got to maintain those standards. And as people want to start getting into that Garrison mentality, leaders are the ones that have to go down and just say, hey, look, we still have a mission here. There's still a threat. And, you just have to make it better. So no, that's a good point.
No, Roger, that's sir. And this kind of leads me to, you retired in 2002. So obviously it was post 9/11, but we had a relatively small presence in Afghanistan at that time compared to how we built up. We weren't
Right.
in Iraq yet, but obviously you stay in touch with people. You saw how things unfolded, but now here we are. We're not involved directly in what's going on in Europe currently, but we have a post-Soviet Russian army in a war on the European landmass, and things probably seem kind of familiar from
Oh,
your time in Germany, from what you're seeing in the news now.
absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
so my question to you is, do you feel, and feels not a bad word, based off your professional judgment, has the technology advanced so much that we need to be considering new EW threats, new cyber threats, or can we apply the lessons of the past in terms of fieldcraft, rigor, doing the basics? What is the best way, in your opinion, in an open source type environment to ensure you're operating correctly as a signaleer in that environment in the 21st century?
That's a really good question. We always have to be cognizant that they're going to be listening. And the threat can be not even next to you. It can be back in the Ukraine or Russia someplace. And so what we have to do is to make sure that we are always adhering to the proper procedures, whatever those procedures are, that codes are being updated when they're supposed to be, that you actually have physical eyes on cables, that somebody's always out there taking a look at it. And you can get so complacent, especially being in those environments.
Yes, sir.
That you that you don't understand what it is that what you're saying on the telephone. And yes, telephones are supposed to be encrypted, but then there's also places where they're not encrypted.
Yeah, sir.
So the behavior, if you're lax in your procedures and you aren't emphasizing security all the time, then people will just be talking on the phone, talking back to Fort Hood or Fort Bragg or whatever, and telling people, hey, all this stuff's going on. Somebody's going to be listening in on that. So I would like to think that our security is better, but I'm not sure it is.
Now, the one thing that concerns me, and just doing this conversationally now, is literally every soldier's an emitter now, because I don't know any kid who doesn't have a cell phone.
Yep.
It,
Yep.
it's and you have those stories coming out of the Ukraine that, oh, somebody had their fitness tracker and we knew what was going on, and or there was
Yep.
uh, we were able to actually contact a soldier and they answered the phone and we were able to,
Yep.
locate that position and bring fire on it, what have you. And the only I'm relieved I don't have that challenge as a commander, because I don't know if I can take a digital native like my kids who grew up in, in the cell phone era, and change 18 years of behavior. Because I'm willing to bet, and this is supposition, that if I put a kid in front of a tactical system, they would do everything right if they were properly trained. But
Yep.
if I didn't tell them they couldn't bring their personal device to the field, they would revert to those 18 years of behavior they had before they enlisted without even thinking about it, because it's just
Yep.
ingrained in them. And that's what's going to get people hurt.
Yep. No, I mean that's that's another great observation. So, this little thing right here is the I mean, I get upset whenever especially when it comes to security and sloppy security procedures. Because I've read the same accounts that you have, where people have watches like what I've got on here, where they can track it, they know exactly where they're at, and so therefore they can put two and two together and figure out what's going on. So I think it's a unique challenge for today's leaders to understand what that threat is, and that it's a real threat, and they got to do something about it. My fear is that because we have cut the signal corps in particular, that we're not getting that kind of message that's going out into the field the way it should be. But
Package.
that's only a supposition on my part. I don't know that for a fact.
No, that's fair, sir. I understand completely, and I appreciate your candor. Getting a little bit more personal, throughout the course of that, I think you said it was a 32-year career, sir.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So you went from, second lieutenant running around Germany with 3rd Infantry Division, all the way up to chief of signal, there at
Yep.
Signal Towers at Fort Gordon. What
Yep.
what is the most significant occurrence in your career? Like what do you identify as a watershed moment, as a soldier, as a leader?
um, there were two or three. And I always did things the way it was supposed to be done, but I also broke the rules when I needed to break the rules to make sure that something happened. So I'll relate three quick stories for you. And if we run out of time, look, you just say, hey, you see, because the problem is you've asked a general to talk. And then you said, okay, it'll be about 30 minutes. And I'm like, what do you mean 30 minutes? um, okay, so the first one, I was in command of the 143rd Signal Battalion. We transitioned to MSE, and I gave up command while we were in training. And that was in June of 1990.
Oh,
And that was when signal battalions, divisions were C4 for training because MSE was so problematic. And and I had to plan the capability exercise, and I wasn't going to be in command. And I thought about it, and I said, we've got to jump a note in training. And everybody was, I mean, I was getting all kind of hate mail from Buckholz and everybody else. No, the signal corps, that blah, blah, blah. So I went over and talked to the division commander because I had to brief General Funk on that. And I went through and I said, sir, and you need to jump a node. And he kind of sat up. He said, Pat, you're going to get me in a lot of trouble. I said, sir, look, I'm getting the same calls that you're going to get. I said, but think of it this way. Not only are you going to be C4 for the foreseeable future, but when you come out of MSE training, your signal battalion is still going to be C4 or C3 at best for another 2 years, is what they're telling you. And I said, what better time than to do something that nobody else has done than when it happens on a capability exercise. Because I'm telling you, the 143rd can do it, because I handpicked every one of those soldiers for every one of those positions. I sweat blood on it. I had my commanders, command sergeant majors, first sergeant, and we picked, they were all good soldiers, but we could only take, I think it was like 450 out of like 650 out of the battalion. And I went in and so when I briefed General Funk, I said, sir, these are good soldiers. They are going to do exactly what it is you want, and you're going to be proud of them. And he said, okay, we're going to jump a node. Well, as soon as that happened, well, then, I mean, everything blew up. Funk was getting all kinds of calls. I was getting them saying, hey, look, this is what we ought to be doing. I gave my best advice to the division commander. And what I said to him was, sir, you ought to demand that your signalers can provide this for you. And he shook his head and said, Pat, you're right, we're going to do it. So they jumped a node on the capability exercise, and everything went fine. Nobody in the Army had done it before that. And oh, by the way, the rest of them in 5th Corps, because I went up to become the Deputy G6 after I commanded, nobody jumped a node again because they were all too scared. So what happened in August of 91? Saddam Hussein attacked, took Kuwait, and by golly, they took the 3rd Armored Division and they went to war, and they went to war with brand new MSE equipment, only having one real exercise, which was the capability exercise. And so the plan that they had for the war, I had nothing to do with that. They all did it. Bill Burst did a great job with all of that. But as soon as they came back from the war, General Funk called me up at 5th Corps and said, Pat, I want to talk to you. He said, I'm so proud of those signalers. He actually called them your signalers. He said, we were getting ready to go into the attack. He said, we had the V, we had the tanks out front, and right behind the tanks were your signalers. He said, and we slowly would go off. Your signalers were right behind them. We would drop a node, and before people had moved very far, they were already up on the air, and we just kept dropping nodes. And he said, we talked to anybody we wanted to at any point during the battle. And he said, and the Corps commander was always flying to the 3rd Armored Division because he knew that he could communicate to anybody from the 3rd Armored Division. And so that was one of my watershed moments. The second one, fast forward, I'm now in the 5th Signal Command. So you understand, I've come up with the infantry and the armor folks. I wasn't a signalier. I was those, and I happened to wear flags and understood how to make that stuff work to facilitate what they were doing. And so we had, I called them strategic battalions. I had some talks with some senior officers who kept saying, no, those are fixed battalions. I said, well, the other 2 are tactical battalions. No, those are mobile battalions. I said, no, I prefer to think of them as tactical battalions and strategic battalions because of the reach that you get. And so that's the way that I viewed life. So I had some very smart people. And I said, we've got to do better. I said, we've got to do, because when I was in the Deputy G6 up at 5th Corps, we were pushing people out to the war in 91, sending them down to the Gulf. And I watched as they were painstakingly going over trying to figure out what was equipment and assemblages were going to go on what aircraft. And if a commander, once they're in that tip-fid list to go, if a commander wants to make any change in that aircraft, they get kicked out and they go to the back of the line and start all over again. And I looked at them going through and said, well, but we, that signal equipment, they've got too much, and so we got to cut it in half. And I mean, it was just a mess. And so I remembered that. And then when I went into the signal command and I looked at all of these great big, echelons above corps rigs, I said, this isn't going to deploy real easy if we got to go do something. So I said, we got to come up with something much smaller, bigger punch, bigger bandwidth than what we can normally provide. So they came back to me with a satellite terminal, a switchboard, voice and data, red switch capability. And we did that in 3 vehicles and 9 people. And we could get bigger bandwidth than what an entire signal company could do.
That's awesome.
So
one observation, if I can make one observation, sir, and I apologize for interrupting. The just the shift in mindset from fixed mobile to strategic tactical. Not only is it exciting me from the standpoint of a guy who, I can't speak to early 90s signal doctrine as much as I can speak to overall doctrine. Yeah. Tactical, operational, strategic, that's how we fight, the 3 levels of war. So what level you're supporting, that makes so much more sense. And the mindset behind fixed, the minute you call your position fixed, you don't think you're going anywhere and you start to grow. And so just changing that one word to strategic, okay, strategy may require me to be expeditionary. And so then once you change that mindset, you can focus on your priorities. It just makes so much sense to me.
Man, why didn't you come and work for me?
I think I would have liked that, sir.
But I mean, I had some really great people that came up with that concept. So I sat down and figured out how we're going to do that, because there wasn't an MOS in the Army that would do all that stuff. So what we did was we asked for volunteers. He said, if you come and if you'll become one of these super troopers, so to speak, and we call those dragon packages because the 5th Signal Command wore a dragon on our left sleeve on the patch. So we call them dragon packets. And they volunteered, and we put them through school. I got Cisco engineers to come in. I had satellite experts that would come in. I had red switch people that would come in. So when I sent those men and women off to do whatever it was they were going to do, I was confident that they knew everything about those assemblages, how to make them work, and any problems and how they could work around it. And then we sat down and figured out that we'd need 22 of those. So I started building those, and I went to the CG of the United States Army Europe, a guy with a great vision by the name of General Montgomery Meigs. And I laid the concept out, and I explained to him that if we had to deploy, he wouldn't have to deploy great big huge signal assemblages, but here's how you do that. And he fell in love with it, and he put a lot of the money for us to do that. So then the air war in Bosnia hit. And so what we had to do was we had to send people to Bremerhaven, we had to send them to Italy, we had to send them to Greece, Albania. And we literally surrounded them. And I had built 21 when the war started. And I had finished the 22nd one before it was over. And I had every one of those deployed all over Europe, making that very complex operation work. And I don't know how we would have done it if we hadn't have done that.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, the nerd in me's got to ask the question, sir. It's not a glamorous question. Since you were building tailored capability with some commercial off-the-shelf assets, how did you handle sustainment?
You're talking about from a training standpoint or from equipment?
I'm talking from an equipment standpoint, sir. I think because I get the vibe that the training, you had the right people.
Yeah. It wasn't an issue, because if we needed it, General Meigs was very, very good about getting what we needed for it.
Tracking.
So I mean, that really wasn't it. In fact, it was easier, because since we were using a lot of commercial off-the-shelf stuff, I mean, it was a lot easier to be able to go out and get stuff and put it in.
Tracking, sir. Makes sense.
So then with that, and the final one, and this will be the last, you won't ever ask me a question like that again.
I'm learning a ton, sir.
So I become the chief of signal. I'm at Fort Gordon. And General John Abrams was the TRADOC commander. And he had been bemoaning the fact that we bring all these young men and women into the Army, and then we keep them in the training base a long time. And in some times, it's a year and a half before they ever get to their first duty assignment. And he said, nobody joined the Army to go to school for the whole time they're in the Army. So we need to figure out how we can get them out of the training base and into the into their units earlier, and we get more return on our investment. So I again had some very smart people, and we found a place up in Research Triangle up in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, and they showed me how with computers they could design any piece of equipment that I wanted, and they could do anything with that, and you could have a soldier do it. So what we picked was the MSC equipment, and we had a computer mock-up of it. The soldier would, and this was all self-paced, by the way. So I think we were taking us 25 weeks to train somebody to be a radio operator with MSC. And so what we did was, on the left-hand side of the computer screen, there would be what the PMCS tasks were. And then across the bottom, they'd have the TM reference so that you could actually hit on that, and the TM reference would come up and you could read about it. And then you would have the assemblage, and the pointer looked like your finger like this. So you'd take the pointer and you put it on the part that you wanted to move, for example, the door handle, and you'd pull that down and the rig would automatically open and you could see inside the rig. Then you'd step inside the rig and you'd start hitting dials. You'd hear the fans starting to whir. You'd hear the alarms going off, and you had to do the right sequence to make all that stuff work. So I got it from 25 weeks down to 13 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And soldiers were coming out of there. I mean, they just couldn't do it fast. I mean, they loved it because they were going through at their own pace. And some of them were going too fast. And we had instructors there making sure that everybody was really getting it, because then we'd take them out and we'd do hands-on. Okay, now we want you to go do it for real. And the final one was, you got to be able to make it all work. We'll introduce some faults, and you'd have to do it. So we put some real fidelity into it. So those are three things that I bring up. I think I'm old, and I even forget what the question was, but I think what is the three most significant, or what was the most significant thing? Well, I made it not one, but I made it into three.
No, well, that's fantastic, sir. Because what I'm taking away from there, what it comes down to each time is train as you fight. That's what I'm hearing across all three of these stories. And training as you fight, it comes down to leadership. It comes down to knowing your doctrine. It comes down to leading your soldiers. So like that's the ultimate lesson. So I couldn't ask for three better anecdotes, sir.
Well, you're being very kind. Plus, you also have to remember, in those days, I had the best signaleers ever in the history of the world, too.
Roger that, sir. And proud to be a signaleer myself. So I'm tracking, sir.
And I could look anybody in the headlights and thump them in the chest. I don't care what their branch was, and say, I put my soldiers up against yours any day, and we'll see who can perform those kind of the tasks that they're supposed to do and do it best.
No, that's awesome, sir.
I'm very proud of our signaleers.
Roger that. I appreciate you taking time to share, sir. We're about at the end of our time. So anything you want to bring up that we haven't addressed? You've answered all my questions, and I appreciate it.
No. I mean, if I sat here, we need to get off here pretty quick before I think of something else that I could go on for about.
Well, hopefully I'll see you at All-American Week sometime, sir, and we can continue this conversation at a more relaxed pace.
I'm looking forward to it, Ben. Hey, look, thanks. I really enjoyed this. I appreciate it.
Awesome, sir. So everybody, this is Ben Powers. I've been coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest tonight is Major General retired Pat Cavanaugh, United States Army. General, it's been an honor talking to you tonight. Thank you very much for coming out.
I enjoyed it, Ben. See you.